The wilderness therapy industry, especially here in Utah, is struggling. Just in the last year, we've seen 4 programs close, leaving 5 that are open. And those that are open are struggling. Looking at inspection records, they are operating at a fraction of the number of students that they normally have. This industry hasn't really struggled like this for 2 decades. Not since the 1990s and the early 2000s, when there were a number of deaths within the wilderness programs, have we seen this kind of pressure and closures in the industry. What's driving this now is negative attention from former residents. They're going on TikTok, on YouTube, they have Netflix shows, and they're sharing their negative experiences now. And the industry says that's really hard to combat. They feel like there's only one side of the story being told, and that they're really struggling to maintain their business with all this negativity around them. Paired with this negative attention, there's also this issue of money. Private equity's pulling out of this industry, and the financial resources that maybe were there before just aren't there now. There's a real question of whether this industry can survive over the next 10 years. The wilderness therapy industry, at least in the Western US, is really rooted at Brigham Young University. There was a student there named Larry Dean Olson in the 1960s. He had kind of an after-school survivalist course he was running, and it caught the attention of BYU administrators. They saw the students that were there were improving, they were doing better at home. And so together they kind of thought of this idea of, what if we take a bunch of flunking BYU students, put them in the wilderness with Larry Dean Olson's course and see what happens. And what happens was their grades improved, they stayed in school, they became more productive. And so this is kind of where the root of the idea of going out into the wilderness to better yourselves or to become a better student gets its start from. As the wilderness therapy industry starts to grow, there's this one guy, his name's Steve Cardizano, who really takes this idea of being out in the wilderness and realizes that you can make a lot of money off of it. Other people were charging a couple $100s for these programs. He jacked up the price and was charging, tens of thousands of dollars for his programs. He also was taking more of a military style approach. He's marching kids through the desert. He's more punitive, which is not what Larry Dean Olson and some of these originators had in mind when they were doing these programs. After a girl died of heat stroke in one of his programs in the 1990s, Steve Cardizano was banned in Utah from ever having a program or working with children again. After Steve Cardizano got kicked out of Utah, he started programs in places like Hawaii, the US Virgin Islands, Costa Rica, and Samoa. Steve Cardizano's programs were not the only problem. There were kids dying in wilderness therapy programs in Utah and other programs as well. There was one death that really led to a lot of the regulatory changes. It was in 2002. His name was Ian August. He was hiking in the desert in really high temperatures and just couldn't hike anymore. He fell down and he eventually died of hyperthermia. Staff had accused him of faking his symptoms because he didn't want to hike anymore. And that was something that other kids who died in wilderness therapy programs also were accused of doing. They said they were faking it, and so they didn't get the medical help that these kids needed. In a 12-year period, 5 kids had died, and this really got the attention of Utah regulators. They were shutting down these programs where the deaths had happened, but they decided more was needed, and so they put more regulations in place, which included everything from how much water a kid has access to, how heavy their backpack can be, what kind of equipment they need. So this was the first time we really saw some real regulations being put in place, at least in Utah, for how these kids can be treated in these programs. With these deaths in the wilderness programs in the 90s and 2000s, obviously that brought a lot of negative attention to the programs. Then 2008 happens, the Great Recession, and it's really hard for a lot of these programs to just stay in business. A lot of them close. I spoke with Will White. He's an advocate for wilderness therapy, and he's also spent a lot of time researching its history.
I think the speed of the closures in this time, in 2008, 9, 10, 11, it was more of a slow closures, and this time it was it's much quicker. Mm-hmm. Some is obviously the negative experiences of former clients who refer to themselves as survivors. And those are amplified in news stories as well as in social media.
After those laws in the early 2000s were passed, really nothing happened regulation-wise for almost 20 years. But in 2021, there was a lot more pressure again on the industry. There was Paris Hilton, she was speaking out about her time at Provo Canyon School. There was media, the Salt Lake Tribune started doing a lot of stories about the conditions that these students were in. And that led legislators to pass a pretty big reform bill that made a lot of changes to these programs. Students now have access to their parents. They can talk to them on the phone without having someone listen to them. They can't be chemically sedated or secluded. They can't be held in painful restraints. And inspectors are coming into the facilities more often now, so hopefully if there are problems, the state can spot them sooner. The narrative is really being driven by the former residents who were in these programs. They're going on social media, they're going online, and they're sharing their stories, many of which are pretty negative. So today, if you go on TikTok and you search wilderness therapy, lists of videos will come up, and they're talking about things like a girl talking about how she didn't get water while she was in her program.
I was unable to drink the water because of how dirty it was, and I became severely dehydrated.
Being kidnapped from their rooms and being taken to these programs.
You're kidnapped in the middle of the night, and then you're taken to this program either in handcuffs or in the back of a vehicle that's child locked.
These are stories of trauma that are easily accessible to anyone with a TikTok account.
As far as my period, mine completely stopped because of the physical and mental stress that I was under. Other girls, you would have to...
We spoke with the Outdoor Behavioral Health Care Council. They're a group of wilderness programs throughout the country, and they said that this negative attention online is one of the biggest challenges that they're facing as businesses right now. This is what they told us. The social media and news media climate around treatment programs has been one of the biggest challenges over the last several years. And unfortunately, only one side of the story is being told so publicly. The portrayal of programs today is not representative of what is actually happening in OBH programs today. There are unlicensed programs out there, and there are programs that need to be closed if they do not adjust their practices, and we support that they are being challenged. I talked with Meg Applegate. She's the CEO of an advocacy group called Unsilenced.
So I think that coupled with, the sheer amount of stories and experiences that have flooded social media, I think it's really confronted this industry in a way that they really have nowhere to go.
So some of these former residents aren't just staying on social media. They're taking their programs to court and they're filing civil lawsuits. And in the last 2 years, we've seen 3 programs in Utah sued with some pretty familiar allegations, things like dehydration or a student complaining that they needed medical care and they were ignored or told they were faking it. These programs are being accused of similar accusations in 2021 as they were in the 1990s. This is a critical moment for the wilderness therapy industry, especially here in Utah. We're seeing programs close because of negative attention and some of financial problems involving private equity. And there's a real question of whether this industry in its current form can survive over the next 10 years.